So this is my panel that I'm going to be working on, but I'll get into that soon. To begin with, I just want to talk about the references that we'll be working from. So the first one we've got is, this is a deer skull, so it's a doe skull that I have. Don't know where it is at the moment, roughly to hand. Somewhere over there behind me. But so this is a doe skull with some ivy from my garden sort of wound through it. So it's actually sort of woven into the sort of behind the eye socket around the sort of temporal lobe of the deer. So it kind of winds in and out of the skull. And generally this is sort of meant to be a bit like a still life encapsulation of say a deer that's died in a forest and then it's become overgrown. So it's sort of a distillation of that idea. In terms of choice of forms, this is something that repeats through all of the paintings. So each piece has a large white object. So in the case of this one, it's a skull. In this one, I'll go over this in detail, but it's a little piece of sculpture. And then in this one, it's another, so it's a human skull. Partly I find this is useful compositionally because when you have a still life that you want people to sort of engage with, it can be tricky when you have lots of little objects. So from sort of trial and error in the past, I found if there were just lots of flowers, there's not a sort of relatively larger object that sort of creates a counterpoint to those smaller detail objects. So if you've got things like these flowers, in each of them have the flowers, the larger white object kind of gives you this nice sense of a sort of solid form. And ideally you want the larger objects and the smaller objects to sort of work together as they do in all these references. So yeah, that's pretty much the idea behind the first one. So it's this sort of overgrown, as with the last one, it's a sort of memento mori, is a sort of to remember that you will die, basically, which obviously fits into the Gothic theme. And it also goes along slightly with the idea of a vanitas, which is to do with vanity as a sin and not being vain about your material appearance or your material wealth. And both of those are traditionally very common still life subject matters. So these are all sort of play to a certain extent on those sorts of traditional ideas, but then they're sort of contemporized, which is my general approach to still life painting. I think still life is a very interesting media or sort of subject to work in because traditionally it was usually quite an overlooked painting subject. So in 19th century tradition, still life was the bottom of the pile. It was sort of to a certain extent considered sort of derogatorily by Victorians or 19th century artists to be like a feminine pursuit. So men would paint like sort of big Greek or sort of classical scenes and stuff like that. And it was more of a kind of hobbyist, sort of female hobbyist painters subject matter. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to do with still life in terms of reclaiming it and making it quite interesting. So yeah, that's my kind of general take on the importance of still life. And definitely like nowadays, I think a lot of still life tends towards repeating traditional forms of still life. So people do like pots or jars and flowers, which are nice, but they don't necessarily kind of make the most of the interesting things that you can do with themes in still lifes. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this deer one. Compositionally, it's upright. So we've got two that are upright and one that's horizontal, and that might affect your choice. I think this is going to be the one I'm going to paint from. I did actually sort of want to paint the human skull, but the width of my camera, it makes a bit more sense I can get my palette in and my reference all at the same time if I work from this one. I might swap to the other one. I'll see how it all lines up when I start painting. So the next option is this. This is a fragment of a face cast from a sort of French sculpture that I have. So if I spin my camera around in the background, and you can see she's got a nest on her head right now. But yeah, that's the original sculpture that I've cast this little face fragment from. I've got a few of them actually. So just another sort of, get my, so I've got a couple of them that I've made for different paintings, but basically it's just a fragment that I use. I find it interesting, the sort of fragmentary nature of these parts of the face, so you can sort of use it as a smaller object rather than, sometimes I use the whole thing, but it is quite large and bulky. So for this particular piece, it worked well. The idea behind this one is it sort of has this, oh, great. That's good, Keisha. Yeah, so we've just been going through the references. You've only missed one reference that I talked about, which was this deer skull. So the idea behind this one is it's sort of like again, it has probably a macabre aspect. So there's a famous death mask of a girl who was brought up from the Seine from 19th century Paris, which became a very commonly painted face cast, but it was made from her after death, but she'd been preserved in the water, so it has this quite sort of ghostly aspect to it. So it's a bit of a reference to that. Generally, the sort of fragmentary nature being sort of overgrown is similar to the deer skull, so it has this idea of sort of nature taking back over something that's sort of something human that's broken down. So yeah, that's the sort of general sort of feel of it. So it's meant to be a sort of a bit beautiful, but then slightly dark as well at the same time. And these flowers, I don't actually know what they are. Someone probably knows what they are, but they're growing in my garden at the moment. So all of the different flowers were just collected from my front garden, basically. And I've got them drying sort of up there right now. So can't actually tilt that far up, but Montbretia. Yeah, thanks, Anne. Yeah, so I've got a million of those growing in my front garden. They seem to have self-seeded everywhere across the whole pathway. So I didn't mind picking some of them. So we've got those flowers. And again, they sort of color-wise, the ivy is obviously predominantly green. So we'll be working a lot more with green mixtures. I'll be getting into the palette later. This obviously will be going more for our kind of orange mixtures. So we've got our bright cad reds and cad yellows should be able to achieve that. But I'll be kind of working you through those color mixtures. Obviously, I'm only going to be painting one. So depending on which one I pick, I'll be kind of giving you some advice generally. If you're not sure, as you're doing color mixtures and if you're working on a different piece to me, just type in your chat box and sort of just give me a brief overview of what you're struggling with, and I'll give you some advice about different color mixtures. But I will do an overview of the whole palette and the idea behind the structure of the palette, the colors that we're working from. So yeah, that's this second choice. One thing actually I really like about the second choice, that when I was setting it up from a just purely aesthetic point of view, is it has some really nice, quite soft shadows. So it was lit by daylight in my studio. All of these were lit by daylight about the same time. So there's some nice little shadows cast on the face by the flowers, so which creates a sort of nice interaction between objects. And there's also a nice sort of slight variation between sharpness of shadow edge from the softer shadows that have more of a penumbra, and then these sharper shadows. And I tend to like exploring that in my work as well. So I tend to sometimes I do these paintings that are just sort of hovering objects that play a lot with different shadow types. But there is a lot of nice kind of like fuzzy shadowness to the background here. And working on these shadows for both of these, it'll help a lot in terms of creating a sense of it being three-dimensional, sort of popping off the canvas. So that'll be an important aspect of more so the second and third, or a little bit today, actually. We'll be working on shadows today, and then the sort of final session where we're trying to really sort of soften things out or add a level of finesse to the painting. So yeah, the shadows I particularly like in this one. And finally, this is a slightly different type of setup. So it's more of a traditional shadow box setup, which is a bit sort of Dutch still life. And it wasn't actually exactly a shadow box that I used. There is a little bit of editing I did in Photoshop, which is something I also do quite a lot. So if I do hovering pieces, and I intend to do a sort of hovering painting workshop that goes through the whole process of creating the original reference, because there's a lot of photo editing that goes on if I work from photo references. If I work from life, then I just do it. You can obviously do it in your head, that sort of editing. But I had to do a little bit of sort of patching up of the background. The background was also a bit browner, so I sort of grayed it out a bit. We're going to go for more of a grayish background for this one. And there are some nice textures going on. So again, it's a fairly memento mori-ish, fairly obvious thematically. So it's got these dead dahlias. I think I actually know what these ones are. So these dried dahlias, and the skull. And so they're sort of adorning the skull. So it's a little bit like when you wear flowers in your hair or something like that. So it's a bit of a vanitas again. And it's got this is a little timepiece, a little old piece of clockwork, which I use occasionally. Partly texturally, that is a nice sort of, it's a brassy sort of shiny object to be working with, which can be fun to paint. The flowers are then super matte. So because they're dried, they have no real luster to them. If you sort of compare them to these live flowers, it's different when you paint a live flower to a dried flower. You don't want a live flower to feel papery. You need them to feel like they're alive. And it's subtle differences, but it is noticeable, whereas these ones obviously are quite crinkly, clearly dried. But they make for a very sort of matte texture. And then obviously this little clockwork is very shiny. So yeah, we're going to be looking in this one, and then the skull actually is sort of, it's a reasonably good model skull. So the skull itself is sort of like an eggshell texture that we're looking for with that one. But the teeth are a little bit darker in local color. So the actual color of the teeth is darker, but they're shinier. So we're looking for more highlights in the teeth, trying to create a contrast. So there are some nice textures going on in this one. And there's also the floor plane, ground plane, has this sort of slight sheen to it. So it's catching up a little bit of a reflection of the skull. And again, there's some nice shadows, a bit simpler, these shadows going on behind the skull. So that's pretty much it for an overview of the three options. So you can work from any of them that you like. I'm going to either work, as I say, probably either work from this one, or I'm going to work from the final skull one. I'm going to see how my my painting works if it's arranged horizontally, if I can get everything into the camera effectively. But yeah, those are your choices. If you're working from a printout, you probably already printed out whichever one that you're picking. And they're all good. They're all sort of should be equally difficult, I would say. There are different things that are difficult about different paintings. So this one particularly has quite a simple form in terms of the skull, but it's quite complex, the ivy. This is sort of moderately complex, both the girl's face and the flowers. And this one again is fairly complex. I would probably say maybe this is the most complex to do, but it's only by a slight margin. So any of them should be fine, regardless of your skill level. So go back to the beginning. So that's it for our references. I'm now going to keep talking just as I go through the setup and the materials that we'll be working from. So I've just got a little, I'll zoom out a bit here as well. So I'm just going to make sure I've got both my palette with reference and some space for the panel. Just going to in my video as well. So I'll just drag my materials over to me. And just swivel it's a bit simpler to swivel my camera around. I'm going to go sort of gradually through everything. This is going to be everything that we use in the whole everything that we use through the whole workshop. So we won't actually necessarily be using everything today, but we'll be using most of what we have today. So first of all, I've got my my panel, which is, let's just get it into camera properly. So mine is a pre-prepared panel from Jackson's, which was on the materials list. So some of you may have got that. But basically any surface that's this size is fine. Even canvas is fine. It doesn't matter too much. If you are working on canvas, ideally you want it to be fairly smooth. This is just hardboard, I think, like prepared hardboard that they sell. It's got a reasonable finish. It's just like a gesso finish with a sort of warm gray. So probably something like Payne's gray-ish color as a straight color, or you could make this color by mixing raw umber with a little bit of black and white would make it as well. It's a very smooth finish. When I prepare them myself, I actually go for a slightly rougher finish, so a bit more washy, just because the washiness actually can sometimes help in terms of plotting your initial kind of drawing, which we'll have a look at. But it doesn't matter too much. This is kind of a nice clean look, so it doesn't matter enormously. It's got a slight sort of stickiness tooth to it, which is similar to if you were to prepare a panel with gesso yourself, but you can prepare pretty much any wood that'll take gesso fairly effectively. So plywood is sort of ideal, I would say, in terms of archivalness. Hardboard is meant to be good as well. MDF, cheaper MDFs, not so much. Hardboard is a type of MDF. And then any canvas will be fine. In terms of size, this is 12 by 16 inches that I'm working to, which is roughly what all of the reference images were designed to fit. So the object should look natural in this size, like about life size, basically, was what I was going for. But yeah, that's it in terms of surface. So if you don't have your surface prepared and you're just working over white, that's totally fine as well. It doesn't make too much of a difference. It just makes it a little bit easier if you have a bit of a tone in place when you're first starting to paint, because you don't have to take the edge off the white. Having a really extreme bright value like white can make it tricky to judge your darker values, because anything painted over white looks quite dark. But if you're painting over a kind of neutral tone like this, you know, your whites will look kind of lighter than it, your darks will look darker than it. It gives you more of a kind of balanced average view of terms of what you're mixing and the colors you're putting on to begin with. So I'll just pop that back up. And I'll start with the palette that we're going to be using. So I'm also just going to hold this somewhere that you can see it and just autofocus. So I've got, to begin with, some titanium white, which is going to be our white, which we'll be using a lot. So I usually buy white in quite large tubes, but you'll be fine with a smaller tube just for this workshop. White's fairly self-explanatory. We'll be using it a lot. One thing to note about white, and this is something I'll be going over throughout the workshop, white basically functions like a gray when you're painting with it. So if you add white to things to lighten them, it will lighten the value of those things, but will also make them more grayish. So we're going to have to be doing some sort of work in terms of trying to compensate for the fact that white is going to make things gray as we paint. But we'll be getting into that a lot more in the workshop. So white is basically white, and it's a very, very light gray, essentially. At the other end, in terms of sort of extreme in terms of value, I've got my ivory black. So ivory black's about the darkest black that we can get for general oil painting purposes. There are darker blacks, obviously, Fanta black and stuff that exist, but for oil painting, ivory black's a fairly standard, very useful traditional black. I know that nowadays a lot of people typically will not use black because the Impressionist approach tended towards emitting black from the palette and only achieving very dark colors by mixing complementaries, which is totally valid. But in a traditional sort of academic sense, black was rarely commonly used. So It's useful if you want to achieve just a pure dark color, which we're going to be, particularly in the deeper shadows in these paintings, we're going to be going into pure black. It's got a nice richness to it. You don't want to use it mixed in with things because it'll tend to gray. But in a pure form or as a glaze, it works well. It can also be very useful for if you mix it with a little bit of white and just make a neutral gray. That can be mixed into colors if you do want to gray them, because sometimes you want to gray things down, and ivory black's useful for that. So it has lots of uses, and we'll definitely be using it a lot for these paintings. Oh, the other thing about ivory black is you want to think of it, it's a gray, but it's also a blue gray. So some blacks tend towards being warm. Mars black, for instance, is a warm black. So when you mix Mars black with white, it'll go a kind of warm gray. If you mix ivory black with white, it'll go a more of a blue gray. So you might find some of your softer, more subtle blues can actually be mixed with just white and black. Which leads us on to our very strong blue. So we've got Prussian blue is the blue I've chosen. This palette is my sort of standard go-to palette, and I'll explain the kind of thinking behind it as we go. The Prussian blue is an extreme sort of high chroma blue, so it's going to be useful for achieving bright greens. Ultramarine blue is also okay, but ultramarine blue is a grayer blue naturally, so if you're trying to get kind of really zingy greens like some of the greens in the ivy, you might struggle a bit with ultramarine blue. It will make a green, but not quite as bright. And that's because Prussian blue has a very high tinting strength. And it's a quite a sort of cool blue, so it works well with a warm yellow like cadmium yellow. But yeah, basically the Prussian blue is our high chroma, so our highly saturated blue, and then ivory black is our grey blue. So that's our sort of blue primaries. Next, we've got in our yellows, I've got some French yellow ochre. Yellow ochre is also fine. I know some people had. Yeah, it's fairly similar to phthalo. Any blue with an extremely high tinting strength is fine. My tendency with this palette is there's one. So with the blues, there's one grey version of a hue, and then one very sort of highly saturated version of a hue. So ideally, you just want to make sure you've got a very bright blue and a grey blue in your palette. There are options that you can go for that are also blue, that are also intensely blue. Prussian is just, I can't remember what series phthalo is, but Prussian is just a useful, quite cheap blue because it's series 1 across all manufacturers. So it's sort of the cheapest that you can get in terms of blue, but it's very strong, so it's super useful. But yeah, I can't remember if it's exactly the same as phthalo or not. It might be less transparent than phthalo. I'm not sure. I think phthalo is a bit more transparent. So yeah, back to our yellows. So we've got French yellow ochre, which is a sort of, you can see it's an earthier, well, it's an ochre, so it's earthy, but it's more of a grayish yellow. Not super gray. It has a nice kind of golden look to it, but you can see it's a lot lower chroma, a lot less saturated than the cadmium yellow. So this is cadmium yellow, just standard cadmium yellow. Not the best. It's a Winsor Newton. It's not my favorite, actually. So if you guys did get a more expensive cadmium yellow, that's probably preferable. But I was trying to keep everything in the equipment and materials is meant to be sort of reasonably affordable. So I'm not making you buy crazy expensive pigments for the workshop. So this is our high chroma yellow. So mixing greens, you could mix a fairly nice green between the ivory black and the yellow ochre will make a really grey green. If you were to mix yellow ochre with Prussian blue, a tiny bit of Prussian blue, it would make a slightly brighter green. If you mix the Prussian blue with the cadmium yellow, that will give us our most extreme green. And it'll be kind of shifts between those that we're looking for as we're painting. We'll get into that more later. But again, the principle is you've got a sort of grayer, darker yellow, and then a brighter, lighter yellow, saturated, lighter yellow, just like we did with the blues. And finally, we've got the same sort of thing going on with our reds. So we've got burnt umber, which is a quite a dark, quite rich grey brown. Again, it's an earth color made from an umber. So the umbers and the ochres, they're all cheap as well. They're all Series 1. It's always preferable to get sort of Series 1 or cheaper pigments from good brands than to buy seemingly better pigments from cheap brands, if that makes sense. Just because it's better to, as soon as possible, you want to start working with true pigments because they react more naturally to being mixed. So we've got burnt umber, which is our grey red brown, and then cadmium red light, which is our bright red. So it's the same idea going on with those. So for things like when we're mixing the yellow orange or kind of red orange flowers, those are going to be mixed more with cadmium yellow, cadmium red light. Some of the grayer versions of them maybe we'll mix a little bit of burnt umber into. For things like the skulls, the white objects, we're going to be using a lot more of the greys and the softer tones. So burnt umber, yellow ochre, black, white. Those are going to be the sorts of colors that we're using for the white objects. The higher chroma colors are going to be specifically used for the brighter things like the green of the leaves, or the orange of the flowers, or the purple, sort of the purple of the flowers. The purples, dahlia flowers will be mixed more so with Prussian blue, and cadmium red will give us those sort of purpley, mauvey tones. So that's it for pigments. As I say, we're not going to be using all of them today. Certainly not in the first session. We're just going to be using burnt umber to begin with. Brushes. If you did buy your brushes from the recommended set, again, I tried to basically find a couple of sets of brushes which would be fairly cheap. I don't think these worked out to too much. I think this set was like £6 or something, and this was maybe 3 or 4, I can't remember exactly, but I don't think they were too expensive, these brushes. So I never used these specific brushes, but they basically should perform as I'd hope for a painting, and they sort of follow how I tend to structure my brushes. Mine are usually, I use Rosemary & Co brushes, so if you're looking for high quality brushes, that's who I'd recommend. But again, I wanted to try to make sure everyone would have roughly what they would need if they didn't have the equipment to begin with. And these are what I'm going to be using for the painting. Usually cheaper brushes are fine, but the main problem with them is they don't last as long when you're painting with them. So I wouldn't expect that these would have the longevity of a better quality brush. But to go through the principle behind them, I've got these ones here. The white brushes are kind of slightly tapered flats, kind of moderate length, maybe slightly shortish. And they're synthetics. They're kind of moderately soft. They're not super strong like a bristle, but they're close to a bristle. And they're good for starting. We're going to be using them to start the painting today. Just because they're good for kind of blocking in, patching colors. That's the idea behind a bristle brush. So if you're using bristles, that's what you want to be using today. These sorts of size brushes, they get paint on quickly. They can carry quite a lot of paint. That's our starting point. We'll also be using them a bit next week for developing form. But you'll get the idea of what we're using because I'll go through it as we work. And then these smaller brushes are going to be more for the detail stuff that we do. Some of it will be next week. We might use these occasionally today, just if we're trying to, when we're blocking in, we're trying to kind of neaten things a little bit, we can use these brushes. But they're a lot softer, so you can see that the springiness of them, they softly sort of spring back more easily. The smaller ones are going to be useful for detail work. Got a reasonable range of them to work with, so we end up with about 8 brushes, which is an okay number. I actually usually paint with fewer brushes than this and just clean a lot. But yeah, these are more for sort of subtler blendings, smaller, finer details that we'll be doing later. So cleaning brushes takes me on to the next thing that we'll be using, which is just, you want some either paper towel or a cleaning rag. Either is fine, just to keep your brushes clean when you need to. So if you're trying to like switch mixtures and you're trying to use the same brush, but you've got some old paint that's say red and you're trying to mix a green, and if you mix the green into the red and green, it's going to go grey. You don't want that to happen, so you want to clean. But I'll always tell you when I'm cleaning, and you'll be able to see me work that way. You probably want it's not absolutely vital, but a palette knife's always useful just for cleaning your palette afterwards, or opening up old paint that's gone a bit dry, those sorts of things. We're not actually going to be painting much with the palette, and we're not going to do any pre-mixes. Palette knives are also used for pre-mixing colors on the palette. That's kind of the main use traditionally for it. That is not something we'll be doing in this workshop. So it's kind of more of a general cleaning tool. We won't need it too much. Then in terms of mediums, I'll be talking a little bit about why we choose certain mediums at certain times. I'll go over it now. It's probably best. So I'm using a solvent. So you always need a solvent, and you always want an oil to work with when working in oils. So I've got some Shell Sol, which is like an odorless solvent from Jackson's. It's still not, you still want ventilation when you're using this sort of solvent, but it evaporates slower than a traditional mineral spirit would, which means that you're less exposed to the toxic particles in the air. So it's a better choice. The less toxic you can go, the better, as always. Some people just use oil when they're working to avoid any toxicity at all, which can work as well. It can be a little bit trickier, but it's still possible to paint that way. And then I've just got linseed oil. So this is cold pressed linseed oil, which has gone reasonably yellow because it's been, I think it's been in a darker portion of my studio. And we're going to be using a mixture of these two throughout the workshop. Today we'll primarily be using the odorless solvent. Probably won't use oil at all. We might do a little bit for some of the darker colors, but probably not. Then next week we'll be using a mixture where we add maybe sort of 25% linseed oil to 75% mineral spirits. And then the final week we'll maybe be kind of going up to 30% or maybe 20% next week, 30% oil the week after. The reason for that is a really quick overview if you're not aware of this principle, but there's a principle called fat over lean when you're doing oil paintings. So we're going to be doing 3 layers of totally dry oil paint. The first layer is going to be made just with solvent, which will dry the fastest. If we were to put oil in, it would dry slower. So that first layer is going to dry really quick and be dry. The next layer that we put on, we want to incorporate a little bit of linseed oil because it just helps the luster of the paint, helps it flow in a way that would be preferable as we work. So we're going to add a little bit of oil to the mineral spirits. And that layer, the second layer, will dry slightly slower than the first layer. The third week, we're going to then add a little bit more oil again because we wouldn't want the most recent layer to dry at the same speed or faster than the layer below it. If that was to happen, because as the layers dry, there's some shifting in the surfaces, you can get cracking. So cracking is caused by a layer that dries slower being below layers that are drying faster. So if the layer that dries fast goes fast and hard really quickly, but the layer below is still drying for a month or two, that might eventually cause cracking years down the line. That's because oil paint doesn't technically totally dry for about 100 years, which is quite crazy, but it goes touch dry quite quickly, particularly in warmer weather, but it doesn't fully complete the drying process for about a century, which is why cracking can appear a lot later down the line. Not always a massive concern for people painting like nowadays, that what it'll be like in the future, but you never know. So it's always good to use archival principles when you're working. And it just generally, I think it helps the appearance of the image. So as a general rule, just when you're working on your own, you always want more oil gradually in your medium mixtures as you work. So as you add layers within reason, you don't want to, if you start to get to a point where you've got just like 100% oil or 75% oil to 25% mineral spirits and you're doing a lot of layers, you will build too much oil up on the surface and it'll get too oily. So generally we're going to err more on the side of mostly mineral spirits, but gradually adding a bit more oil in as we work. And I think finally, well, apart from my palette, is palette cups. So I mean, you can use pretty much anything that will hold your medium, but these are my palette cups. So I'm going to clip them to my palette, which if I spin around, is just here. So mine are just This is a fairly unorthodox way of clipping your palettes, but it helps for filming. So mine are just clipped underneath there, but usually you slip them over your palette as you're working. So yeah, and there's my palette. So you can see there's some old paint and it's sort of washed down. So any sort of palette will be fine. You can use a handheld palette, you can use a tabletop palette, you can have a palette next to your painting like mine is. Whatever you're comfortable with is good. So I'm just gonna get my setup right.